For months, Western intelligence had been tracking increased communications between Russia and China, while separately monitoring China's growing ties with Iran and Russia's deepening relationship with North Korea. These bilateral connections created the impression of a coordinated axis of upheaval throughout late 2024. Intelligence warnings documented arms transfers and high-level meetings, but no formal multilateral command structure emerged. Then came the crisis that would expose the true nature of these relationships. When Iran desperately needed support in early 2025, the silence from its supposed allies was deafening. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. The reasons behind their abandonment reveal that these alliances were always transactional rather than ideological, built on convenience rather than genuine commitment to challenging Western power. The alliance that never was. The moment of truth arrived in March 2025, when Iran found itself isolated and under unprecedented pressure. Despite years of public declarations about unbreakable bonds and military cooperation that filled headlines across global media, what many had termed the axis of upheaval revealed its true nature when real crisis struck. The authoritarian partnership that had dominated Western strategic thinking for the better part of a decade proved to be nothing more than a collection of fair-weather partners who abandoned their supposed ally when it mattered most. Throughout 2024, Western intelligence agencies had documented significant bilateral cooperation between these nations. Iran had transferred over 3,000 Shahed drones monthly to Russia, sustaining Moscow's war effort in Ukraine. North Korea shipped substantial quantities of artillery shells and ballistic missiles to Russia while deploying military advisors to support operations. Arms transfers reached record levels, with Iran receiving some advanced missile systems from Russia while providing drone technology in return. Chinese investment in Iranian infrastructure accelerated dramatically, creating the impression of deepening strategic coordination. This cooperation raised heightened Western concern about how these bilateral aid links were sustaining Russia's war while potentially creating new security challenges. Intelligence briefings warned that the interconnected nature of these relationships could complicate Western responses to regional crises. European defense ministers received assessments suggesting that coordinated support between these nations had created new strategic vulnerabilities that required careful monitoring. Then came the tests that revealed each nation's true priorities. When Iran faced its most serious security crisis in decades, its calls for assistance echoed through empty halls in Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang. The silence was not just disappointing, but actively damaging to Iranian interests. Where Tehran expected coordinated diplomatic support, it received only generic statements condemning Western actions. Where hope for military assistance, it found empty promises and delayed responses. Where it anticipated economic solidarity, it discovered that its partners were already positioning themselves for a post-crisis Middle East. The speed of the abandonment shocked even seasoned intelligence analysts who had spent years tracking these relationships. Within 48 hours of Iran's crisis beginning, Russian officials were privately distancing themselves from Tehran's position. Chinese diplomats began emphasizing their nation's commitment to regional stability rather than Iranian sovereignty. North Korean representatives simply vanished from international forums where they might have been expected to voice support for their ally. This wholesale abandonment revealed fundamental weaknesses in anti-Western partnerships that had been carefully concealed beneath layers of public rhetoric and ceremonial cooperation. The reality was that despite years of strategic partnership agreements, joint military exercises, and coordinated diplomatic initiatives, none of Iran's supposed allies were willing to accept meaningful costs to support Tehran when crisis struck. Each relationship had been built on mutual convenience rather than genuine strategic commitment. Intelligence assessments from early 2025 documented how each ally bilaterally distanced itself from Iran's crisis. Russia paused defense consultations with Iranian officials and delayed scheduled weapons deliveries. China issued neutral statements calling for de-escalation while avoiding any specific support for Iranian positions. North Korea maintained complete silence, offering no diplomatic backing whatsoever. The elaborate coordination mechanisms that had taken years to develop were quietly suspended as each nation prioritized its own interests. What makes this abandonment particularly significant is that it exposes the hollowness of anti-Western rhetoric that had dominated international discourse. For years, the same leaders who had spent countless hours denouncing American hegemony and calling for a new multipolar world order proved unwilling to take any meaningful action to support that vision when it required genuine sacrifice. Their commitment to challenging Western dominance extended only as far as their own immediate interests allowed. Each nation's decision to distance itself from Iran followed a calculated logic that prioritized national interests over partnership obligations. This represents a fundamental weakness in anti-Western coalitions that Western strategists had long suspected but never been able to definitively prove. Rather than being bound by ideological solidarity or shared strategic vision, these partnerships operate according to cost-benefit calculations that can change rapidly when circumstances shift. The implications extend far beyond the immediate crisis that triggered Iran's abandonment. If authoritarian regimes cannot rely on each other for support during critical moments, the entire concept of a meaningful challenge to Western dominance becomes questionable. The failure of these nations to support Iran suggests that reports of American hegemony's decline may have been greatly exaggerated. Classified intelligence reports from 2025 document not just the abandonment itself, but the coordination between the abandoning parties to ensure their actions did not conflict with each other. This suggests a level of cynical calculation that goes beyond simple self-interest and enters the realm of active betrayal. The partners were not just failing to help Iran, but were actively working to ensure their own positions remained secure regardless of Iranian interests. The systematic nature of the abandonment indicates that each nation's decision reflected deeper structural problems with authoritarian partnerships themselves. These regimes had never truly integrated their strategic planning or created genuine mutual dependencies that would make abandonment costly. Instead, they had maintained parallel relationships that could be severed without significant consequences when convenience demanded. Among these betrayals, one stands out as particularly shocking in its calculated cynicism: Russia's strategic betrayal. Russia's betrayal of Iran in 2025 represents one of the most cynical examples of alliance abandonment in modern international relations. When Tehran desperately needed support from its supposed strategic partner, Moscow not only refused to help, but actively worked to distance itself from Iranian interests. This abandonment becomes particularly shocking when viewed against the backdrop of Iranian support that literally kept Russia's war effort in Ukraine alive throughout 2024. The scale of Iranian assistance to Russia during Moscow's darkest hours cannot be overstated. Throughout 2024, Iran supplied Russia with over 3,000 Shahid drones monthly, providing the Kremlin with the means to continue its campaign of terror against Ukrainian infrastructure. These drone deliveries represented a lifeline for Russian military operations at a time when Moscow's own defense production was struggling to meet wartime demands. Iranian engineers worked alongside Russian technicians to establish production facilities on Russian soil, transferring critical technology that allowed Moscow to maintain its offensive capabilities. Beyond drones, Iran provided Russia with ballistic missiles worth billions of dollars, including advanced Fateh, 110 and Zulfiqar missiles that significantly enhanced Russian strike capabilities. These weapons systems arrived at critical moments in the conflict, often within days of urgent Russian requests. Iranian cargo planes made regular flights to Russian bases, carrying not just weapons but also spare parts, maintenance equipment, and technical expertise that kept Russian systems operational. The partnership extended to sharing intelligence on Western military aid to Ukraine, with Iranian satellites providing targeting data for Russian strikes. The hypocrisy of Russia's abandonment becomes clear when examining Moscow's response to Iranian requests for similar assistance. Throughout 2024, Iran repeatedly requested advanced air defense systems from Russia, specifically asking for S-400 missile systems and electronic warfare equipment that would have significantly enhanced Iranian defenses. Moscow consistently delayed these deliveries, citing technical complications and production bottlenecks that somehow never seemed to affect weapons flowing in the opposite direction. Russia provided no meaningful reciprocal air defenses despite Iran's substantial drone technology transfers. The transactional nature of Putin's alliances becomes evident when examining Russia's simultaneous efforts to strengthen relationships with Gulf states throughout 2024. While publicly proclaiming partnership with Iran, Moscow was quietly expanding military cooperation with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Russian defense exports to these nations increased by 300% during 2024, with advanced fighter aircraft and missile systems flowing to the same Gulf states that Iran considered adversaries. This dual-track approach allowed Russia to extract resources from Iran while positioning itself as a reliable partner to Iran's regional competitors. Russian prioritization of Gulf relationships over Iranian partnership was not merely about economics, but reflected a deliberate strategic calculation. Moscow recognized that Gulf states offered more attractive long-term partnerships than Iran, with deeper financial resources and fewer international complications. Russian officials privately acknowledged that partnership with Iran carried significant reputational costs in other regions, particularly in the Middle East, where Gulf states controlled vast energy resources and investment capital. The resource constraints that many analysts cited as the reason for Russia's abandonment of Iran were largely fictional. While Russia certainly faced military pressures in Ukraine, classified assessments show that Moscow possessed sufficient capabilities to provide meaningful assistance to Iran if it chose to do so. Russian military production had actually increased throughout 2024, with defense factories operating at higher capacity than before the Ukraine conflict began. The constraints were not physical but political, reflecting Russia's unwillingness to accept additional risks for the sake of Iranian interests. A deeper strategic calculation involving Russia's relationship with Israel explains much of Moscow's reluctance to support Iran. Throughout 2024, Russia maintained extensive back-channel communications with Israeli intelligence services, sharing information about Iranian military capabilities and nuclear program developments. These communications, revealed in 2025 diplomatic cables, show Russian officials providing Israeli counterparts with detailed intelligence about Iranian defensive preparations and military installations. Moscow viewed its relationship with Israel as more strategically valuable than its partnership with Iran, particularly given Israeli influence on American foreign policy. The diplomatic cables from 2025 reveal Russian officials privately expressing relief at Iran's isolation rather than concern about their allies' predicament. Foreign Ministry communications describe Iran's crisis as an opportunity for Russia to disentangle itself from a partnership that had become increasingly burdensome. Russian diplomats privately acknowledged that association with Iran had complicated Moscow's relationships with other nations and welcomed the chance to distance themselves from Iranian interests without appearing to break commitments. This pattern of abandonment mirrors Russia's treatment of other allies throughout its history. Syria, despite receiving Russian military support, was repeatedly abandoned during critical moments when supporting Damascus would have required significant Russian sacrifices. Armenia faced similar treatment when Russia failed to provide meaningful assistance during conflicts with Azerbaijan. Belarus discovered that Russian support came with strings attached and could be withdrawn whenever Moscow's interests shifted. The pattern suggests that Russian alliances are fundamentally transactional arrangements rather than strategic partnerships based on mutual commitment. Russian officials recognize that Iran's isolation actually served Moscow's strategic interests in multiple ways. A weakened Iran would be more dependent on Russian support and less likely to pursue independent foreign policy initiatives that might conflict with Russian interests. Iranian desperation would also make Tehran more willing to accept unfavorable terms in future negotiations, allowing Russia to extract better deals on energy cooperation and arms sales. Moscow calculated that a partially isolated Iran would be more valuable as a partner than a confident Iran with multiple alliance options. The systematic nature of Russia's abandonment suggests that Moscow may have actively wanted Iran weakened rather than strengthened. Russian intelligence services possess detailed knowledge of Western military preparations and could have provided Iran with valuable warning about impending attacks. Instead, Moscow remained silent while Iran walked into a strategic trap that Russian officials had seen coming for months. This represents not just alliance abandonment, but potential active betrayal of Iranian interests. The timing of Russia's distancing from Iran reveals calculated opportunism rather than spontaneous policy shifts. Moscow began reducing cooperation with Tehran weeks before Iran's crisis reached its peak, suggesting advanced knowledge of events and deliberate preparation for abandonment. This level of premeditation indicates that Russia's betrayal was not a reluctant response to circumstances, but a planned strategy designed to maximize Russian benefits while minimizing costs. Yet Russia's calculated betrayal pales in comparison to the cold economic logic that drove another supposed ally's abandonment: China's economic pragmatism over revolutionary rhetoric. Beijing's response to Iran's crisis revealed the stark reality of Chinese foreign policy priorities. Despite being Iran's largest trading partner, China offered only rhetorical condemnations at the United Nations while quietly repositioning itself to benefit from Tehran's isolation. This abandonment becomes particularly striking when considering that China had positioned itself as Iran's most reliable economic lifeline throughout years of Western sanctions. The transformation of China's investment commitments to Iran tells the story of Beijing's priorities with brutal clarity. Chinese foreign direct investment in Iran had fallen dramatically from expected levels of $400 billion under the 25-year strategic partnership signed in 2021 to just $185 million by 2025. Throughout 2024, Chinese officials had repeatedly emphasized their commitment to this partnership, highlighting massive infrastructure projects and energy investments that would bind the two nations together. The Belt and Road Initiative in Iran was proceeding at record pace, with Chinese companies constructing ports, railways, and telecommunications networks across Iranian territory. Then came early 2025, and those same investment commitments suddenly became conditional on what Chinese officials termed regional stability requirements. The language shift was subtle but devastating. Where previous agreements had included firm timelines and guaranteed funding, new Chinese communications began including escape clauses tied to security conditions and international compliance standards. Chinese companies operating in Iran received quiet instructions to suspend major new commitments pending comprehensive risk assessments of their Iranian operations. The contrast with China's approach to Gulf relationships exposes Beijing's true priorities in the region. While reducing commitments to Iran, China simultaneously expanded its economic relationships with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Chinese investment in Saudi Arabia increased by 180% during the first quarter of 2025, with major new agreements in renewable energy and telecommunications. The UAE received similar treatment, with Chinese companies signing contracts worth $15 billion for port development and logistics infrastructure. Beijing's calculation was straightforward. Saudi Arabia and the UAE offered larger markets, more stable political environments, and fewer international complications than Iran. Chinese officials privately acknowledged that partnership with Iran carried significant risks that partnership with Gulf states did not. The Saudis and Emiratis controlled vast financial resources and maintained positive relationships with Western nations, making them more attractive long-term partners than isolated Iran. The reality of China's energy relationship with Iran reveals the calculated nature of Beijing's approach. While China remains Iran's top trading partner and imports 90% of Iran's oil exports, Iran represents only 10% of China's total oil imports as of 2023. China actually imports more oil from Saudi Arabia than from Iran, giving Beijing significant flexibility in its Middle Eastern energy relationships. This diversification allowed China to reduce Iranian oil purchases without creating energy security problems. Trade data from 2025 shows China's immediate reorientation of Middle Eastern relationships. Chinese imports from Iran dropped significantly during the first quarter of 2025, while imports from Saudi Arabia increased over the same period. Chinese exports to the UAE grew as Beijing redirected trade flows away from Iran toward more stable Gulf partners. These shifts occurred rapidly as circumstances changed in the region. The systematic nature of China's response reveals fundamental aspects of Beijing's approach to international alliances. Chinese partnerships operate according to cost-benefit calculations that can change when circumstances shift. Beijing maintains relationships only as long as they serve Chinese interests, with limited regard for partner expectations or previous commitments. This approach makes Chinese alliances fundamentally unreliable for nations that might need support during crisis situations. Chinese officials demonstrated remarkable pragmatism in their treatment of Iranian expectations. Despite years of rhetoric about strategic partnership and mutual benefit, Beijing prioritized its own interests the moment supporting Tehran would have required accepting meaningful costs. Chinese diplomats issued standard condemnations of Western actions against Iran while privately positioning China to benefit from the changing regional dynamics. The timing of China's policy shifts reveals careful calculation rather than reactive decision-making. Chinese companies began adjusting Iranian operations as Iran's crisis developed, suggesting that Beijing possessed clear assessments of events and prepared accordingly. This level of preparation indicates that China's response was not a reluctant reaction to circumstances, but a calculated strategy designed to maximize Chinese benefits while minimizing risks. China's treatment of Iran extends beyond simple alliance limitation into the realm of strategic positioning. Beijing used the changing circumstances to secure better terms on existing agreements while simultaneously positioning Chinese companies to benefit from regional developments. Chinese officials viewed the situation as an opportunity for securing more favorable deals on energy imports and infrastructure projects. The implications of China's approach extend far beyond bilateral relations between Beijing and Tehran. If China, the supposed champion of anti-Western resistance, prioritizes economic pragmatism over alliance solidarity when real costs are involved, the entire concept of meaningful challenges to Western dominance becomes questionable. Chinese behavior suggests that economic calculations always trump revolutionary rhetoric when significant interests are at stake. China's calculated response to Iran's crisis reveals something fundamental about how Beijing approaches international relationships. Chinese alliances are purely transactional arrangements designed to serve Chinese interests rather than genuine partnerships based on mutual commitment. This makes China an unreliable partner for any nation that might need support during difficult circumstances. Yet even China's cold pragmatism could not have prepared observers for the most unexpected abandonment of all: North Korea's self-preservation instinct. North Korea's response to Iran's crisis demonstrated the regime's ultimate priority: survival above all else. Despite being the most isolated member of the supposed alliance, Pyongyang maintained complete public silence when Tehran desperately needed support. This abandonment becomes particularly striking when considering that North Korea had demonstrated willingness to take extraordinary risks just months earlier, deploying up to 25,000 troops to support Russian operations in Ukraine. Yet when Iran faced its moment of maximum vulnerability, Kim Jong-un's regime refused to provide even symbolic diplomatic backing to its supposed ally. The contrast between North Korea's commitment to Russia and its abandonment of Iran reveals the calculated nature of Pyongyang's foreign policy decisions. Throughout 2024, North Korean forces had engaged in active combat operations alongside Russian troops, accepting significant casualties and international condemnation for their participation in the Ukraine conflict. North Korean artillery units provided crucial support for Russian offensives, while North Korean engineers helped construct defensive positions that proved vital to Russian military operations. This level of military commitment suggested that North Korea was willing to accept substantial risks to support Axis partners. The strategic calculation behind North Korea's refusal to support Iran was rooted in regime survival considerations that overrode any sense of alliance obligation. North Korean officials recognized that supporting Iran would trigger Western retaliation that could threaten the regime's existence in ways that supporting Russia did not. The Ukraine conflict was geographically distant from the Korean peninsula and involved North Korean forces that could be withdrawn if necessary. Supporting Iran would have required North Korea to take positions on Middle Eastern conflicts that could directly threaten North Korean security. Internal North Korean communications from early 2025 revealed genuine fear about potential escalation if they backed Iran during its crisis. Pyongyang's leadership expressed concern that providing support to Iran would make North Korea a target for Western military action. Unlike the calculated risks of supporting Russia in Ukraine, backing Iran presented existential threats to North Korean regime survival that Kim Jong-un was unwilling to accept. The logistical reality of North Korea's position made meaningful assistance to Iran impossible even if Pyongyang had wanted to provide support. North Korea lacked the naval capabilities to transport significant military assistance to Iran, with its aging fleet of cargo vessels unable to reach the Persian Gulf without crossing multiple hostile territories. North Korean air transport capabilities were even more limited, with insufficient range and payload capacity to deliver meaningful quantities of weapons or equipment to Iranian forces. North Korean military production, while substantial for domestic needs, could not support both ongoing commitments to Russia and new obligations to Iran. The regime's defense industries were already operating at maximum capacity to meet Russian demands for artillery shells and other conventional weapons. Diverting production to support Iran would have required reducing assistance to Russia, potentially damaging the more strategically important relationship with Moscow. The technological limitations of North Korean weapons systems also made them poorly suited to Iran's specific defensive needs. North Korean missile technology, while advanced enough to threaten regional targets, lacked the sophistication required to penetrate the advanced air defense systems that Western forces would deploy in any conflict with Iran. North Korean air defense systems were designed for static defense of North Korean territory rather than the mobile, integrated defense networks that Iran would need to counter Western air power. Kim Jong-un viewed Iran's crisis as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overextending against Western powers rather than an opportunity to demonstrate alliance solidarity. North Korean officials privately acknowledged that Iran's confrontational approach toward Western interests had created unnecessary vulnerabilities that North Korea was determined to avoid. The regime's survival strategy depended on maintaining just enough nuclear capability to deter attack while avoiding provocations that might trigger preemptive Western military action. The timing of North Korea's distancing from Iran reveals careful calculation rather than spontaneous policy shifts. Pyongyang began reducing diplomatic cooperation with Tehran weeks before Iran's crisis reached its peak, suggesting advanced knowledge of events and deliberate preparation for abandonment. North Korean diplomats received instructions to avoid forums where they might be expected to voice strong support for Iranian positions. The systematic nature of North Korea's abandonment reveals fundamental aspects of how the regime approaches international relationships. North Korean alliances are conditional arrangements that exist only as long as they serve regime survival interests. When supporting allies would threaten North Korean security, Pyongyang abandons those relationships without hesitation or regret. North Korean officials demonstrated remarkable cynicism in their treatment of Iranian expectations. Despite years of rhetoric about anti-Western solidarity and mutual support against American hegemony, North Korea abandoned Iran the moment supporting Tehran would have required accepting meaningful risks. The regime's historical pattern of abandoning allies when supporting them became inconvenient or dangerous, from communist movements in Southeast Asia to African liberation movements, suggests that North Korean alliances are fundamentally unreliable for any nation that might need support during crisis situations. The realization that even the most isolated regime in the Axis chose self-preservation over alliance loyalty when crisis struck reveals something fundamental about authoritarian partnerships. These relationships lack the institutional mechanisms and shared values that make democratic alliances more resilient during times of crisis. What makes this pattern of abandonment particularly significant is that Western intelligence agencies had been tracking these intelligence assessments for months that changed before Iran's crisis began. Research conducted by the Institute for the Study of War documented the systematic breakdown of these bilateral relationships throughout 2024, revealing patterns that would prove crucial for understanding what happened when Iran's crisis finally arrived. The analysis exposed fundamental fractures in anti-Western partnerships that had been carefully concealed beneath layers of public rhetoric and ceremonial cooperation. Western intelligence agencies had been tracking declining coordination between these nations for months before Iran's isolation became complete. Communications analysis revealed decreased contact frequency between capitals, with routine diplomatic exchanges replacing the urgent strategic coordination that had characterized earlier periods. Response times to important messages increased significantly, and replies became increasingly non-committorial and filled with standard diplomatic language rather than substantive policy commitments. The indicators of alliance deterioration were subtle but systematic. Secure communication channels between the nations were being used less frequently, with classified traffic dropping by substantial amounts during the final quarter of 2024. Back-channel meetings between senior officials ceased entirely, replaced by formal diplomatic encounters that produced little beyond ceremonial photographs and generic joint statements. Military liaison officers were quietly withdrawn from partner nations without public explanation. Financial intelligence provided the most revealing evidence of coordination breakdown. Banking records showed each nation quietly diversifying their economic relationships throughout 2024, reducing dependence on partnerships within the supposed alliance while expanding ties with neutral countries. Chinese banks increased lending to Gulf states while reducing new commitments to Iranian projects. Russian energy companies signed preliminary agreements with Saudi Arabia and the UAE that would have been impossible if Moscow truly prioritized Iranian relationships. The systematic nature of these preparatory actions suggested advanced coordination between the nations to minimize their exposure to Iranian vulnerabilities. Rather than working to strengthen their allies' position, Russia, China, and North Korea were preparing to abandon Iran while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. This level of premeditation indicated that the abandonment was not a spontaneous response to crisis, but a carefully planned strategy. Intelligence analysis revealed that Iran was identified as the most vulnerable member through careful assessment of each nation's strategic alternatives. Russia possessed extensive relationships with former Soviet states and could pivot toward neutrality if necessary. China maintained economic ties with virtually every major economy and could afford to abandon Iranian partnerships without significant consequences. North Korea, despite its isolation, had demonstrated remarkable resilience and possessed sufficient nuclear capabilities to ensure regime survival independently. Iran lacked these strategic alternatives. Its economy remained heavily dependent on relationships with supposed allies, particularly China's willingness to purchase Iranian oil despite sanctions. Iranian military capabilities, while substantial, were insufficient to deter Western attack without external support. This strategic position made Iran inherently dependent on alliance support in ways that did not apply to other members. Classified communications intercepts revealed the supposed allies privately expressing doubts about Iranian strategy throughout 2024. Russian officials questioned Iran's confrontational approach toward Western interests, describing it as unnecessarily provocative given the limited benefits it provided to other members. Chinese diplomats privately characterized Iranian foreign policy as reckless and expressed concerns about being dragged into conflicts that served Iranian interests rather than broader objectives. North Korean communications were particularly revealing in their cynicism about Iranian leadership. Internal documents describe Iranian officials as unrealistic about the level of support they could expect from allies and criticized Tehran's failure to understand the constraints facing other members. These communications suggested that North Korea viewed Iran as a liability rather than an asset within the alliance structure. The intelligence assessment documented rapid deterioration of coordination through multiple indicators that became apparent only when analyzed systematically. Joint military exercises that had been planned for 2025 were quietly canceled or postponed indefinitely. Arms transfer agreements were modified to include escape clauses that allowed suspension during periods of regional instability. Economic cooperation agreements were amended to permit unilateral withdrawal if circumstances changed. Technical intelligence revealed the most damning evidence of coordination breakdown. Military cooperation agreements were suspended pending comprehensive security reviews, while intelligence sharing arrangements were quietly terminated without public announcement. The infrastructure of alliance coordination was being systematically dismantled even as public rhetoric continued to emphasize partnership and mutual support. The analysis revealed something fundamental about authoritarian alliances that academic observers had failed to recognize. These partnerships operate according to cost-benefit calculations that can change rapidly when circumstances shift, rather than being bound by institutional mechanisms or shared values that make democratic alliances more resilient. Authoritarian regimes maintain relationships only as long as they serve immediate interests, with limited regard for partner expectations or previous commitments. Intelligence analysts recognize that this pattern of abandonment revealed fundamental weaknesses in all anti-Western alliances. If authoritarian regimes could not rely on each other for support during critical moments, the entire concept of meaningful challenges to Western dominance became questionable. The assessment concluded that reports of American hegemony's decline had been greatly exaggerated, as potential challengers proved incapable of maintaining solidarity when real costs were involved. The most disturbing realization was that Western intelligence agencies understood the alliance would abandon Iran before Iran itself recognized its vulnerability. Iranian intelligence services continued planning based on assumptions of alliance support even as their supposed allies were already preparing for abandonment. This intelligence failure on Iran's part reflected fundamental misunderstandings about how authoritarian partnerships actually function. Yet the full scope of this betrayal only became clear when classified financial data revealed the true calculations driving each nation's decision. The economic reality behind the betrayal. Banking records and trade statistics from 2025 reveal the stark calculations that drove each nation's decision to abandon Iran. Every supposed ally prioritized their existing economic relationships with Western nations over Iranian solidarity, protecting billions in commerce that supporting Tehran would have jeopardized. The numbers expose a level of economic dependence on Western systems that made supporting Iran economically impossible, regardless of public rhetoric about anti-Western resistance. Russia's economic calculations were particularly revealing. Despite years of sanctions, Moscow maintained substantial trade relationships with European Union nations through indirect channels and third-party arrangements. Russian energy exports to Western Europe continued flowing through pipeline networks that generated crucial revenue for the Russian treasury. Supporting Iran would have triggered secondary sanctions that could have severed these economic lifelines, potentially devastating the Russian economy. Russia was already constrained by its war in Ukraine and chose not to transfer air defense systems to Iran, prioritizing its own military needs over Iranian requests. The hypocrisy becomes clear when examining Russian trade patterns during Iran's crisis. While publicly condemning Western actions against Tehran, Russia quietly increased energy exports to European markets during the first quarter of 2025. Russian officials privately acknowledged that European energy purchases provided more revenue than the entire Iranian relationship, making the choice between supporting Iran and maintaining European trade relationships straightforward. China's economic vulnerabilities were even more extensive. Despite rhetoric about challenging Western hegemony, Chinese trade with Western nations represented over 40% of China's total international commerce in 2024. Chinese manufacturing depends heavily on Western technology imports and market access that generate employment for millions of Chinese workers. Supporting Iran would have triggered comprehensive economic retaliation that could have devastated Chinese manufacturing and caused massive unemployment. China imports 19% of its oil from Russia, demonstrating the complex web of energy relationships that influence Beijing's calculations. Classified financial intelligence from 2025 reveals the true cost calculations behind China's abandonment of Iran. Internal Chinese economic assessments projected that supporting Iran would reduce Chinese GDP by significant percentages within the first year through lost Western market access and technology transfers. Chinese officials calculated that the entire Iranian relationship generated far less revenue than Western trade relationships. The mathematical choice was obvious even to officials who privately supported Iranian positions. North Korea's economic considerations reflected the regime's survival priorities. Despite its reputation for isolation, North Korea maintained indirect trade relationships with Western-aligned nations through Chinese intermediaries and third-party arrangements. Supporting Iran would have triggered enforcement actions that could have severed these economic lifelines, potentially threatening regime stability. North Korean economic planners privately acknowledged that Iranian support would cost more than the regime could afford. Internal documents show North Korean officials calculating that comprehensive Western economic retaliation would reduce foreign currency earnings dramatically, creating shortages that could trigger domestic instability. The regime's survival strategy depended on maintaining just enough economic activity to fund essential government operations while avoiding provocations that might trigger devastating sanctions. The systematic nature of economic calculations reveals something fundamental about how authoritarian regimes actually prioritize relationships. Each Axis member possessed detailed assessments of economic costs associated with supporting Iran, and all reached identical conclusions about the impossibility of accepting such costs. These calculations were not made in isolation, but reflected comprehensive strategic planning that prioritized regime survival over alliance obligations. Banking records from 2025 show that each Axis member began reducing economic exposure to Iranian institutions well before any crisis materialized. Chinese banks suspended new lending commitments to Iranian projects during the final quarter of 2024, while Russian financial institutions required additional collateral for existing agreements with Iranian entities. North Korean trading companies quietly diversified their partnerships to reduce dependence on Iranian markets. The Axis members were economically dependent on the very Western system they claimed to oppose. Russian energy companies relied on Western technology for extraction operations that generated the majority of government revenue. Chinese manufacturers depended on Western markets for export sales that employed hundreds of millions of workers. North Korean trading operations required access to Western-controlled banking systems to conduct international commerce. Financial intelligence reveals that supporting Iran would have triggered devastating economic retaliation that none of the Axis members could afford. Western economic warfare capabilities include secondary sanctions that can isolate entire economies from international financial systems. Russian officials privately acknowledged that comprehensive economic retaliation could reduce Russian GDP substantially within 2 years. Chinese assessments projected even more severe consequences if China faced comprehensive Western economic isolation. The speed of economic calculations reveals the premeditated nature of the abandonment. Each Axis member possessed detailed contingency plans for reducing Iranian exposure that were implemented within days of crisis beginning. Russian energy companies immediately increased production for European markets to compensate for potential Iranian losses. Chinese manufacturers accelerated negotiations with Western partners to secure market access that might be threatened by Iranian associations. Trade statistics from 2025 show the massive economic stakes involved in the decision to abandon Iran. Combined trade between Axis members and Western nations far exceeded trade within the Axis itself. The economic incentives for maintaining Western relationships over Iranian solidarity were overwhelming, regardless of ideological considerations or public rhetoric about anti-Western resistance. The implications extend far beyond bilateral trade relationships to reveal fundamental weaknesses in anti-Western alliances. If supposed challengers to Western dominance remain economically dependent on Western systems, their ability to sustain meaningful opposition becomes questionable. The Axis members discovered that their economies were too integrated with Western markets to accept the costs of genuine confrontation. The realization that economic pragmatism always trumps ideological solidarity reveals something fundamental about modern international relations. Authoritarian regimes may espouse revolutionary rhetoric about challenging Western dominance, but their actual behavior reflects cold calculations about economic costs and benefits. When supporting allies would require accepting devastating economic consequences, ideological solidarity becomes a luxury that survival-focused regimes cannot afford. Yet the full extent of this calculated betrayal only became apparent when diplomatic communications from 2025 surfaced, revealing conversations that would shock even seasoned intelligence analysts. The diplomatic cables that exposed the truth. Public statements from Russian, Chinese, and North Korean officials during Iran's crisis revealed the calculated nature of their abandonment through what they chose not to say, as much as what they did. While each nation issued standard diplomatic condemnations of Western actions against Iran, their responses were carefully crafted to avoid any commitments that might require actual support. The contrast between public rhetoric about strategic partnerships and the reality of diplomatic abandonment exposed the hollow nature of these relationships when real costs were involved. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova condemned Western attacks on Iran as violations of international law, while simultaneously emphasizing Russia's commitment to diplomatic solutions to regional conflicts. The language was deliberately neutral, avoiding any suggestion that Russia might provide material assistance to Iran. Russian officials consistently framed their response in terms of general principles rather than specific support for Iranian positions, creating diplomatic distance even while appearing to express solidarity. Chinese Foreign Ministry statements followed a similar pattern of expressing concern while avoiding commitments. Chinese officials called for restraint from all parties and emphasized China's support for peaceful resolution of regional disputes. The language carefully avoided taking sides in the conflict, treating Iran's crisis as a general regional problem rather than an attack on a strategic partner. Chinese diplomats consistently emphasized diplomatic solutions over any form of material assistance. North Korean responses were even more revealing in their absence. Pyongyang maintained near-complete silence about Iran's crisis, offering only brief statements through state media that condemned Western actions without mentioning Iran by name. North Korean officials avoided international forums where they might be expected to voice strong support for Iranian positions, demonstrating their determination to avoid any association with Iran's predicament. The systematic nature of these diplomatic responses reveals coordination between the supposed allies to minimize their exposure to Iranian expectations. Each nation's statements followed similar patterns of expressing general concern while avoiding specific commitments to Iranian defense. The diplomatic language was carefully constructed to preserve the appearance of alliance solidarity while providing no actual support that might require accepting costs or risks. United Nations Security Council meetings provided the most revealing evidence of coordinated abandonment. When Iran's crisis reached the Security Council, Russia and China issued standard condemnations of Western actions while refusing to support stronger measures that might have provided meaningful assistance to Iran. Chinese representatives abstained on key votes rather than supporting Iranian positions, demonstrating Beijing's unwillingness to accept diplomatic costs for the sake of Iranian interests. The contrast between public rhetoric and diplomatic reality became apparent when examining the specific language used by each nation's representatives. Russian officials consistently described Western actions as concerning rather than unacceptable, while Chinese diplomats emphasized dialogue over resistance. North Korean statements, when they appeared at all, focused on general principles of sovereignty rather than specific support for Iranian positions. Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir-Abdollahian's increasingly defiant public statements during the crisis revealed Tehran's growing awareness of its isolation. Iranian officials began criticizing their supposed allies' responses as inadequate, with Amir-Abdollahian specifically calling for concrete support rather than empty words from partner nations. These public criticisms exposed Iranian frustration with the diplomatic abandonment they were experiencing. The timing of diplomatic statements revealed the calculated nature of each nation's response. Russian condemnations appeared hours after Western attacks began, suggesting careful preparation rather than spontaneous reaction. Chinese statements were even more delayed, appearing only after Beijing had time to assess the full scope of the crisis and craft responses that minimized Chinese exposure. North Korean statements were so delayed and generic that they appeared to be afterthoughts rather than genuine expressions of concern. The systematic nature of diplomatic abandonment extended beyond refusing assistance to actively undermining Iranian expectations. Russian diplomatic communications emphasized Moscow's commitment to regional stability rather than Iranian sovereignty, while Chinese statements consistently called for de-escalation rather than resistance to Western actions. These diplomatic positions effectively endorsed Western demands for Iranian compliance rather than supporting Iranian resistance. The most revealing aspect of the diplomatic response was what each nation chose not to say. None of the supposed allies threatened retaliation against Western actions, despite years of rhetoric about mutual support and strategic coordination. None offered specific assistance to help Iran defend itself, despite possessing capabilities that could have meaningfully supported Iranian resistance. None even suggested that Western actions might trigger broader regional conflicts that would require their involvement. The diplomatic abandonment revealed fundamental weaknesses in authoritarian partnerships that public analysts had failed to recognize. These relationships operate according to immediate strategic calculations rather than institutional commitments or shared values. The diplomatic responses showed that authoritarian regimes maintain alliance relationships only as long as they serve immediate interests, with no regard for partner expectations or previous commitments. The systematic nature of diplomatic abandonment exposed the transactional nature of authoritarian relationships through specific examples of cost-benefit calculations. Each nation's diplomatic response reflected careful assessment of the costs associated with supporting Iran versus the benefits of maintaining relationships with other regional partners. The mathematical choice was obvious even to officials who privately sympathized with Iranian positions. Yet the diplomatic calculations that drove this abandonment were ultimately secondary to a more fundamental reality that would become apparent when military assessments revealed the military capabilities of each supposed ally. Assessments from 2025 reveal the practical constraints that made supporting Iran impossible for each supposed ally. The resource limitations that became apparent during Iran's isolation were so severe that abandonment reflected capability gaps rather than purely political calculations. These assessments expose how the Axis had been built on rhetoric rather than genuine military cooperation capabilities, with each member nation lacking the resources or strategic positioning necessary to provide effective assistance to Iranian forces. Russia's military constraints were the most obvious, but also the most consequential for Iranian expectations. Russian forces remained heavily committed to operations in Ukraine, with substantial troops deployed along an extensive front that required constant reinforcement and resupply. The Russian military had suffered significant casualties throughout 2024, with equipment losses creating additional resource pressures. Russian logistics systems were already stretched supporting operations along the Ukrainian border, with ammunition shortages forcing Moscow to rely on North Korean supplies to maintain artillery operations. The strategic reality was that Russia lacked the military capacity to open a second front in support of Iran without catastrophically weakening its position in Ukraine. Russian air defense systems were concentrated along the Ukrainian front, leaving minimal reserves that could be deployed to protect Iranian airspace. Russian military planners privately acknowledged that supporting Iran would require diverting resources from Ukraine that could result in operational collapse along critical sectors of the front. Internal Russian military communications from early 2025 described the impossibility of providing meaningful air defense support to Iran while maintaining defensive operations in Ukraine. Russian officials calculated that deploying even minimal air defense systems to Iran would create vulnerabilities that Ukrainian forces could exploit to achieve breakthrough operations. The Institute for the Study of War documented these resource constraints extensively, noting how Russia's war effort had stretched military capabilities to their limits. China's military limitations were equally constraining despite the People's Liberation Army's impressive modernization efforts throughout the 2020s. Chinese military capabilities remained primarily focused on regional operations within the First Island chain, with limited power projection capabilities beyond the South China Sea. The PLA Navy possessed insufficient transport capacity to move significant military forces to the Persian Gulf, with Chinese amphibious capabilities designed for Taiwan scenarios rather than Middle Eastern operations. Chinese military assessments recognized that supporting Iran would require establishing supply lines across thousands of kilometers, including passage through waterways that could be easily interdicted. Chinese logistics systems had never been tested for operations at such distance from Chinese territory, with fuel, ammunition, and maintenance requirements that exceeded established capabilities. The PLA's combat experience remained limited to border skirmishes and exercises rather than sustained operations against technologically advanced opponents. The Chinese military's primary strategic focus remained the Taiwan scenario, with operational planning and resource allocation concentrated on potential conflict in the Taiwan Strait. Chinese military planners calculated that diverting resources to support Iran would weaken Chinese capabilities for the Taiwan contingency that represented the regime's core strategic priority. Internal Chinese military communications describe Iranian support as strategically impossible given resource constraints and competing priorities. North Korea's military limitations were perhaps the most severe among the Axis members. Despite possessing substantial conventional forces on paper, North Korean military capabilities were designed for defensive operations on the Korean peninsula rather than power projection to distant theaters. North Korean logistics systems lacked the capacity to support significant military operations beyond the immediate vicinity of North Korean territory, with fuel and ammunition reserves insufficient for sustained operations away from established supply bases. The North Korean military's equipment consisted largely of obsolete systems that would be ineffective against modern air defenses and precision strike capabilities. North Korean air defense systems were based on older Soviet technology that offered minimal protection against contemporary aircraft and missiles. North Korean naval capabilities were limited to coastal defense operations, with no capacity for long-range transport or naval support operations in distant regions. North Korean military planners recognized that any attempt to support Iran would expose North Korean forces to devastating retaliation that could threaten regime survival. The regime's military strategy depended on maintaining defensive positions that maximize casualties for potential attackers while minimizing North Korean exposure to precision strike capabilities. Supporting Iran would require North Korean forces to operate in environments where they would face overwhelming technological disadvantages. The military assessments reveal that each Axis member lacked the integrated command structures and interoperability that would enable effective military cooperation during crisis situations. The Axis members had never developed the military cooperation mechanisms necessary for coordinated operations against Western forces. Joint exercises had been limited in scope and focused on symbolic cooperation rather than genuine operational integration. Military pragmatism rather than political cowardice drove the Axis members' abandonment of Iran. Each nation's military leadership recognized that supporting Iran would expose their forces to defeat that could threaten regime survival. Russian military commanders understood that diverting resources from Ukraine would create vulnerabilities that could result in operational collapse. Chinese military planners recognized that supporting Iran would weaken Chinese capabilities for Taiwan scenarios while exposing Chinese forces to devastating retaliation. The realization that military pragmatism drove the abandonment of Iran reveals something fundamental about how authoritarian regimes calculate military risks and benefits. When supporting allies would require accepting military defeats that could threaten regime survival, ideological solidarity becomes strategically impossible. Yet these military calculations were ultimately reinforced by an even more fundamental consideration that regime leaders could not ignore: the domestic pressure factor. Each regime's leadership faced the fundamental challenge of maintaining domestic stability while considering foreign commitments. Internal assessments within Russia, China, and North Korea revealed that supporting Iran would create domestic consequences that could threaten regime survival more than abandoning an ally. The calculations were brutal in their simplicity. Each government prioritized internal stability over external alliance obligations when forced to choose between competing pressures. Russian leadership faced mounting domestic pressures that made additional foreign military commitments politically dangerous. The Russian public was already suffering from economic hardships caused by the Ukraine conflict, with inflation and consumer goods shortages affecting major cities. Additional military commitments would have required increased defense spending that could only be funded through higher taxes or reduced social spending, both politically risky options for Putin's regime. Russian officials recognized that domestic political costs of supporting Iran exceeded any benefits for maintaining Iranian relationships. The Russian public's war fatigue was reaching critical levels by early 2025. Declining support for military operations abroad created domestic pressure that made additional foreign military involvement politically toxic. Putin's advisors warned that supporting Iran could trigger domestic unrest that would challenge regime stability. Russian leadership understood that citizens would not tolerate significant sacrifice for Iranian interests, making meaningful support politically impossible even for an authoritarian government. Chinese leadership faced similar domestic constraints despite the regime's authoritarian control over public discourse. Internal Communist Party assessments warned that supporting Iran would trigger economic consequences that could undermine social stability. Chinese citizens were already facing economic pressures from slowing growth, and additional economic disruption from Western sanctions would have created conditions that could threaten social stability. The Chinese leadership recognized that economic hardship could trigger protests that would challenge regime legitimacy. The Chinese regime's legitimacy depended on delivering continued economic growth, making policies that threatened prosperity politically dangerous. Chinese leadership discussions focused on maintaining economic development rather than supporting Iranian positions. The regime calculated that supporting Iran would reduce Chinese economic growth significantly, creating unemployment that could affect millions of workers. Chinese officials prioritized domestic economic stability over foreign policy solidarity with Iranian interests. North Korean domestic calculations were perhaps the most desperate among the Axis members. Despite the regime's total control over information, internal assessments warned that supporting Iran could trigger economic disruption that might destabilize the country. North Korea's economy remained vulnerable to disruption, with the regime dependent on Chinese trade for basic necessities. Western sanctions triggered by Iranian support could have reduced imports that kept the population stable. The North Korean regime's survival strategy depended on maintaining just enough economic activity to prevent domestic rebellion. Kim Jong-un's advisors calculated that supporting Iran would create domestic economic conditions that could threaten regime survival within months. North Korean officials expressed relief at avoiding commitments that could threaten domestic stability, recognizing that foreign adventures typically resulted in increased domestic hardship. The domestic political calculations reveal how each regime prioritized survival over alliance obligations. Russian officials acknowledge that domestic political costs of supporting Iran exceeded any benefits for maintaining Iranian relationships. Chinese leadership recognized that economic disruption would threaten social stability more than abandoning Iranian interests. North Korean officials calculated that supporting Iran would create domestic conditions that could trigger regime collapse. These domestic factors reveal fundamental weaknesses in authoritarian solidarity that extend beyond immediate political calculations. Authoritarian regimes must consider domestic political costs when making alliance decisions, even when controlling information and suppressing dissent. The Axis members discovered that their citizens would not tolerate significant sacrifice for Iranian interests, making meaningful support politically impossible regardless of public rhetoric about strategic partnerships. The classified communications reveal internal debates within each regime about Iran policy that prioritize domestic political survival over alliance obligations. Russian officials debated whether Iranian support was worth the domestic political costs, ultimately concluding that regime survival required abandoning Iranian interests. Chinese leadership discussions focused on maintaining economic growth rather than supporting Iranian positions. North Korean officials recognized that comprehensive sanctions would create conditions that could threaten domestic stability. Each authoritarian regime assessed domestic consequences when considering foreign support, making alliance commitments conditional and unreliable. When supporting allies would require accepting domestic political costs that could threaten regime survival, authoritarian partnerships become strategically impossible. The Axis members chose domestic political stability over alliance obligations, revealing that even dictatorships must consider internal pressures when making foreign policy decisions. The realization that domestic political pressures constrained even authoritarian regimes exposes the limits of ideological solidarity in modern international relations. These regimes proved incapable of sustaining meaningful support for allies when such support would threaten their own internal stability. The systematic nature of this abandonment suggests that authoritarian alliances are fundamentally unreliable when crisis strikes, as each regime ultimately prioritizes its own survival over partnership obligations. Yet the domestic calculations that drove this abandonment were only part of a larger strategic failure that would prove even more revealing about the nature of modern geopolitics. The strategic miscalculation that doomed Iran. Iran's strategic miscalculation about its relationships with Axis partners represents one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures in modern Middle Eastern history. Tehran misread loyalties when it assumed Axis solidarity would hold, fundamentally misunderstanding the transactional nature of authoritarian partnerships. Iranian leadership confused shared anti-Western rhetoric and ceremonial cooperation with binding strategic commitments, a misunderstanding that proved devastating when Iran faced its greatest crisis in decades. Iran's expectation of support was unrealistic given historical patterns of Russian, Chinese, and North Korean transactional behavior. These nations had consistently demonstrated that their partnerships operate according to immediate self-interest rather than ideological solidarity, yet Iranian strategic planners ignored these warning signs throughout 2024. Tehran had assumed that providing substantial support to partners during their own crises would create reciprocal obligations for future Iranian needs, failing to recognize that authoritarian regimes accept assistance without acknowledging binding commitments for future support. The strategic error was rooted in Iran's fundamental misunderstanding of how modern authoritarian alliances actually function. Iranian officials assumed that ideological alignment against Western hegemony created mutual defense obligations similar to formal military alliances. This calculation proved catastrophically wrong when crisis struck and Iran discovered that its partners viewed the relationship as a convenience rather than a commitment. The Axis members had never accepted binding obligations to support Iran during conflicts that did not serve their immediate interests. Iran's leadership was surprised to be isolated based on patterns of prior cooperation that had created false expectations about alliance reliability. The regime had interpreted arms transfers, high-level meetings, and joint military exercises as evidence of genuine strategic partnership rather than temporary arrangements based on mutual convenience. Iranian officials had dismissed reduced communication frequency and modified cooperation agreements throughout 2024 as temporary adjustments rather than signs of fundamental relationship changes. The isolation Iran faced was partly self-inflicted through unrealistic expectations of alliance behavior that ignored the fundamental characteristics of authoritarian partnerships. Iranian strategic planning had been based on assumptions about alliance reliability that reflected wishful thinking rather than realistic assessment of partner motivations. Tehran had confused public rhetoric with private commitment, assuming that ceremonial cooperation indicated genuine strategic partnership. Iran's intelligence underestimated authoritarian partners' self-interest calculations, leading to flawed strategic expectations about alliance reliability. Iranian analysts had focused on positive indicators of cooperation while ignoring evidence of declining commitment from Axis partners. The regime's analytical framework failed to account for the economic, military, and political factors that would ultimately determine partner behavior during crisis situations. The strategic miscalculation was based on Iran's fundamental misunderstanding of modern geopolitics and how authoritarian regimes actually calculate costs and benefits. Iranian leadership assumed that shared opposition to Western dominance created binding strategic relationships, failing to recognize that authoritarian partnerships operate according to immediate self-interest rather than ideological solidarity. This misunderstanding left Iran vulnerable to abandonment when crisis required genuine sacrifice from supposed allies. Iranian military commanders expressed particular confusion about the abandonment given their previous support for Axis partners during their own crises. The regime had provided over 3,000 Shahid drones monthly to Russia throughout 2024, sustaining Moscow's war effort in Ukraine at considerable cost to Iranian resources. Iranian officials had assumed that their contributions to Russian operations would create obligations for future support, discovering too late that authoritarian regimes view such assistance as transactions rather than investments in mutual commitment. The gap between Iranian expectations and partner responses revealed fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of authoritarian cooperation. Iranian officials had expected coordinated responses to Iranian crises similar to NATO Article 5 guarantees, failing to recognize that authoritarian alliances lack such institutional mechanisms. The transactional nature of these relationships meant that past Iranian contributions created no obligations for future partner assistance. Iranian diplomatic efforts to invoke previous agreements and partnerships as justification for expected support fell on deaf ears. Iranian officials referenced years of cooperation and mutual assistance as evidence of binding strategic relationships, only to discover that their partners viewed these arrangements as temporary conveniences rather than permanent commitments. The systematic nature of the abandonment revealed that each Axis member had been preparing for this moment, quietly reducing their exposure to Iranian vulnerabilities while maintaining the appearance of partnership. The revelation that Iran's strategic miscalculation was based on fundamental misunderstanding of modern alliance dynamics exposes something important about how authoritarian partnerships actually function. These relationships operate according to immediate cost-benefit calculations rather than institutional commitments or shared values that characterize democratic alliances. Iranian officials had confused authoritarian cooperation with genuine strategic partnership, leading to devastating miscalculations about partner reliability during crisis situations. Iran's abandonment was as much about their own strategic failures as their allies' betrayal. The regime's misunderstanding of authoritarian partnership dynamics created vulnerabilities that partners exploited for their own benefit. This miscalculation would prove to have implications that extended far beyond Iranian interests, fundamentally altering how the world understands the balance of power global in the 21st century. The collapse of Axis solidarity during Iran's crisis reveals something fundamental about how power actually operates in the modern world. When authoritarian regimes abandon their supposed ally at the moment of greatest need, they expose the hollow nature of anti-Western coalitions that had dominated strategic thinking for years. The systematic abandonment demonstrates that authoritarian partnerships operate according to convenience rather than commitment, making them fundamentally unreliable as the basis for sustained opposition to established international order. The broader implications are clear. If authoritarian regimes won't support each other during crisis situations, the entire concept of a multipolar world order remains a fantasy rather than an emerging reality. The Axis members proved incapable of accepting meaningful costs to support a partner, suggesting that reports of American decline have been greatly exaggerated. The failure to support Iran demonstrates that authoritarian alliances lack the institutional mechanisms and shared values necessary for effective cooperation against Western powers. Global powers adjusted their strategies after witnessing the Axis's failure to maintain solidarity when real costs were involved. The abandonment served as a powerful demonstration of the differences between democratic and authoritarian alliance systems, with many governments reappraising their relationships after seeing Iran's isolation. Nations that had been hedging their bets between Western and authoritarian partnerships began recognizing the unreliability of anti-Western coalitions when crisis strikes. The abandonment of Iran actually strengthens Western alliance systems by demonstrating their reliability compared to authoritarian alternatives. NATO's response to the Ukrainian crisis showed democratic allies maintaining support for partners despite significant economic and military costs. The contrast with authoritarian behavior during Iran's crisis highlighted fundamental differences between democratic and authoritarian partnership approaches. Western alliances proved more resilient because they operate according to institutional commitments rather than immediate convenience. Democratic alliances possess mechanisms for burden sharing and mutual support that authoritarian partnerships lack. NATO's Article 5 guarantees create binding obligations that members honor even when costs are substantial. The European Union's mutual assistance clauses have been invoked to support members facing various crises. These institutional mechanisms make democratic alliances more reliable during crisis situations than authoritarian partnerships based on personal relationships and immediate interests. The contrast between Western and authoritarian alliance reliability became apparent to nations worldwide following Iran's abandonment. Countries that had been considering partnerships with authoritarian powers began recognizing the superior reliability of democratic alliances. This shift in perception strengthened Western alliance systems by making them more attractive to potential partners who valued reliability over rhetoric. The failure of authoritarian coordination strengthened Western strategic positions by reducing the credibility of alternative alliance systems. Nations that had been hedging between Western and authoritarian partnerships began tilting toward Western alliances that offered more reliable commitments. This shift reduced the strategic options available to authoritarian powers while expanding Western influence in regions where competition had been intense. The long-term consequences for international relations extend far beyond the immediate crisis that triggered Iran's abandonment. The systematic failure of authoritarian solidarity creates precedents that will influence future alliance calculations and conflict patterns. Nations considering partnerships with authoritarian powers must now account for the risk of abandonment during crisis situations, making such alliances less attractive than previously assumed. Future conflicts will likely follow patterns established during Iran's abandonment, with authoritarian powers avoiding meaningful support for partners when real costs are involved. This pattern makes regional conflicts less likely to escalate into global confrontations because authoritarian powers will prioritize self-preservation over alliance obligations. The result may be a more stable international system where regional conflicts remain contained rather than expanding through alliance mechanisms. The implications for alliance structures worldwide are profound. The failure of authoritarian solidarity during Iran's crisis demonstrates that these partnerships lack the institutional foundations necessary for sustained cooperation. Democratic alliances benefit from this contrast by offering more reliable alternatives to nations seeking security. guarantees, and economic partnerships. The Axis's abandonment of Iran revealed fundamental weaknesses in anti-Western coalitions that extend beyond immediate crisis response. These partnerships operate according to transactional logic rather than institutional commitments, making them unreliable foundations for long-term strategic planning. The systematic nature of the abandonment suggests that similar failures will occur whenever authoritarian allies face genuine costs for supporting partners. The 2025 crisis demonstrated that authoritarian alliances cannot supplant Western systems because they collapse when real costs are involved, reinforcing U.S. alliance resilience. The revelation that authoritarian powers cannot sustain meaningful opposition to Western dominance when real costs are involved has implications that extend far beyond the immediate crisis. The failure of the Axis to support Iran suggests that challenges to American hegemony remain limited by the inability of authoritarian powers to coordinate effective responses to Western actions. The Axis had intended to create an alternative to Western dominance, but instead provided evidence of why such alternatives remain ineffective when tested by real crisis situations. By demonstrating the unreliability of authoritarian partnerships, the abandonment made Western alliances more attractive to nations worldwide. The systematic failure of authoritarian solidarity revealed fundamental weaknesses that may define how international crises unfold for years to come. The 2025 crisis exposed the transactional nature of modern authoritarian alliances while revalidating the resilience of Western partnerships. Despite years of public declarations and ceremonial cooperation, Russia, China, and North Korea chose self-preservation over solidarity when supporting Iran would have required accepting meaningful costs. This event demonstrates that economic pragmatism and regime survival always trump ideological rhetoric in modern geopolitics, regardless of how passionate the anti-Western declarations might sound. The Axis collapse proved that ideological solidarity cannot bind authoritarian regimes when self-interest is at stake. Supporting allies based on rhetoric rather than realistic assessment of partner motivations guarantees abandonment when crisis strikes. Democratic alliance structures offer more reliable foundations for global stability than authoritarian experiments that collapse under pressure.